All right. Hey guys, welcome back. This is going to be the start of lesson 2 of unit 3 at this time. Please open up your journals, go to the next new clean sheet and write your heading at the top of the paper. Unit 3, Progressive Era, 1890, 1929. Lesson 2, Progressives Drive Reform. Remember the Progressive Era, we're trying to make things better because we had all those problems in the Gilded Age, like workers being taken advantage of, the government being controlled by big business, environmental concerns, farmers being taken advantage of, and so on. Don't forget also to write your essential question. You can write EQ. How did progressives seek reform? That means to fix things during this era. Make sure to write that down. If you need more time, pause it. There's the hungry, starving, poor coal mine faces of those little kids because child labor was a thing during this time period. That's one of those things we want to try to fix. And as soon as you have your heading, let's begin. All right, progressivism, the idea of trying to make things better due to all the problems happening, is going to emerge in the end of the 1800s, the 1890s, alongside that new political third party we've been talking about, the Populist Party. Remember the Populist Party? They're also called the People's Party because they want power to the people. And who are the Populists or the People's Party? Bum, 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 bum. They are farmers, that's right. Now, there were very different kinds of people that made up progressives. So they're wanting some of the same things as the populists, but just because you were a progressive didn't make you a populist, because progressives were a much wider group of Americans. There's the bell. Welcome back to school, right? They were a much wider group of Americans than just these poor farmers out in the South and West, as the populists were. Progressives were, many of them, middle class. They were wealthier. Some of them were even quite wealthy, very rich. Many of them were very educated. There were women and men that were these progressives. Some of them were from the cities. Some of them were from the more rural places that's out in the country. But they were a very wide gathering of Americans. And in fact, many of them were wealthier. They were driven by a desire to act out of the good of charity. Maybe because of their Christian values. This is kind of like the gospel of wealth that Andrew Carnegie will talk about. The idea that if you're a rich person, if you want to go to a good place, you need to give back to those less fortunate. You need to devote your life and your riches to charity, to helping out those who've not had the opportunities that you have had. So that's progressives, middle class, well-educated, many of them. They're going to be fighting for reforms like to end child labor, to get women the right to vote. They're going to be fighting to end alcohol in America. That was something progressives wanted. The temperance movement, it's called, to temper alcohol. They want to put an end to the corruption in businesses and corporations taking over our government and the influence of these robber barons. These are the kind of things progressives want. And there you see in this wonderful political cartoon down here, here's like votes for something, I can't quite read it, women, it might be votes for women, because that is a woman there. And remember, women's suffrage is something progressives want. They want women to have the right to vote. And this is actually an idea that it looks like it's coming from the Western states over here towards the East, and all these people, they want to have these progressive ideas like women's suffrage. They're getting it from the West to the East because remember, populism has its roots out in the South and the West. It's the awakening of America. Okay. What do they want? They want to correct the abuses of industry and urbanization. Urbanization, the growth of cities. Yes, cities grew really fast during the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, but there were a lot of problems that came about with this growth of cities. You mean not just that they didn't have proper sewage or water, you know, those things were being built and oftentimes not being built fast enough, so sanitation was a concern, but also problems with so many immigrants and poor people coming to the cities, trying to find work in those factory jobs, because that was where, you know, there were lots of jobs available. They weren't great jobs, but there were jobs there. You had so many people that you quickly get overcrowding, and you get people, you know, being treated very poorly because they were so easily replaceable that these machine factory workers, they were being treated like machines. They were being treated like machines themselves. Like we see in the metaphor of the Wizard of Oz, that's the Tin Man, right? He's heartless because he's a machine. Well, these factory workers, yeah, if one got hurt on the job, they would be replaced. They wouldn't get any kind of, insurance or coverage. They wouldn't get any kind of reimbursement for their damages or loss of limb. They would just be fired and somebody else would replace their job, and the situation would never get better. So progressives are going to want to help the labor unions in trying to improve the life of the workers, getting better pay for those workers. They want to get safer conditions. They want to make the cities cleaner. They want to root out also corruption in the cities, such as those political machines. And they want to end the practice of child labor. Little kids, at this time were working in coal mines. They were working in all sorts of factories. They were, of course, working on farms. But especially the children working in the coal mines, and especially those working in factories, progressives want to end that practice of child labor. Kids under the age of 16 should not have to do hard labor all day long. They should be in school, and that's what progressives want. They want the government to be the one to do these things. They want the national government to take over, to regulate, to impose rules, to make society better. That's what reform is, right? Fixing things, making things better. And that's what a progressive is. They want to make things better. They want the government to be the force to do this. The government's going to need to get a lot bigger in the minds of these progressives. There is a cartoon right here of Theodore Roosevelt. He's commonly known as Teddy Roosevelt, one of our future presidents. Here he is as a hunter. He was a big outdoorsman and hunter, and he got the nickname Teddy because he didn't want to hurt a teddy bear that they had captured and had before him. He didn't think that was sporting, that the bear was tied up. So he's Teddy Roosevelt. But here he is. He's hunting and killing those bad trusts, those bad monopolies, the companies that were abusing people and taking advantage of workers and limiting competition. He's getting rid of those, and he's keeping the good trusts with restraint, basically imposing rules and regulations on the good monopolies and getting rid of the bad ones. That's what progressives want to see happening. During the progressive era, you see volunteers like this lady here from the Salvation Army helping those less fortunate in many ways. Why would progressives like this woman here, see if the question will, pictured above want suffrage? So suffrage means the right to vote. We're talking specifically during this time period about half of Americans not being able to vote legally under the Constitution because women could not vote. Remember that the 15th Amendment, it gave men of all colors the right to vote. However, there will be ways in which many African Americans, men and women, will be kept from voting even after all men of all colors were supposed to be given that right. Southern states will impose through like Jim Crow laws, segregation laws. They'll put up like literacy tests and poll taxes and many other ways they'll try to keep blacks from being able to vote. All that being said, though, keep in mind that legally, constitutionally across the country, no woman of any color, white, black, purple, or brown, or anything, could vote at this time. So that's why women are fighting for the right to vote. Now, it's a state-by-state issue. So like I said before, previously in lesson 1, there were some Western states, because of the Populist Party and the influence that women had within the Populist Party, there were some Western states that were allowing women to vote before the passage of the 19th Amendment. But nationwide, women like this woman giving back to charity, doing charity work, want the right to vote because they want to see the government help the poor. They want to see the government help children, not to have, these jobs in factories. They want to end child labor. They want to see life in general improve for workers, all over. They want to see the government impose regulations on railroads who were exploiting farmers. They want to do all these things, like end alcohol in America, temperance. But unless they can vote, the government isn't going to listen to them. They have to have that ability to have their voices heard, and that's their vote. That's why women were fighting for suffrage at this time, so that they could have these other reforms take place. They needed to be heard. So that's the votes for women. Remember, that's what suffrage is. It's the right to vote. Please highlight that. Make sure you know that in your notes. Also writing down, progressives want to fix corrupt political machines. We talked about political machines before. Here's a cartoon with it. The most famous one that we had talked about was Tammany Hall in New York City. That was the political machine there, run by like boss William Tweed. So political machines, they would take advantage of the urban poor, particularly the new immigrant populations working primarily in factories. They would hook them up with a place to work in one of the boss's factories. They would hook them up with a place to live, usually in a tenement that was owned by the boss or somebody, one of the boss's friends. And in exchange for this very poor place to work and live, immigrants were indebted to the political machine and loyal. And the political machine would tell them how to vote. And so this big block of voters in the cities would always vote the way the machine wanted them to. And that way, the machine controlled the city. That's how political machine operated. That's how they were in control. And the boss, remember, he didn't need to be elected the mayor. He decided which of his minions that worked for him in the machine would be the mayor and the city council. He would reward his loyal followers with those high government positions. And in return, they would reward their boss with the government contracts. So he was raking in all of this money. It was extremely, extremely corrupt. Graft was very common, where for a city project like a library that would normally cost $100,000 at this time to build a new library for the city, these city councils would give the contract over to their political boss, and then his company would do it for like $1 million, and he would keep all that extra money. So that corruption was rife. This is something that progressives want to curtail. They want to get rid of that corruption with the political machines in the cities. They want to root that out. Progressives are also, and we'll talk about how they do that with the Pendleton Civil Service Act in a little bit, but they also want to curtail or limit the power of the big businesses, the monopolies, the robber barons, okay? These corporations, these monopolies like Standard Oil with John D. Rockefeller, that robber baron, they controlled, America at this time. They got William McKinley elected president. Remember, they're having the same influence on many congressmen and senators. They decide, which way Congress votes, and they're going to make sure to protect their business interests and just allow their business to get bigger and bigger. There were no rules restricting monopolies, so you could take over all the other companies until yours was the only one. That's a monopoly in the industry, and then you can charge whatever price you want to have. So progressives did not like this corruption at the national or the local levels of governments. They want to get rid of it. And women were a big part of the Populist Party, and they're a big part here of the Progressive Party. They want to have a say in rooting out corruption and enabling the reforms that they believed in. But the only way for them to have a say was for them to have a vote. So women were also championing at the same time as these reforms their right to vote. Women's suffrage. How did the goals of the progressives over here in blue and the goals of the populists differ? How are they the same? That's in the green in the middle. Populists, they believe in small, simple, rural living. They're poor farmers. That's where they started off with in the South and the West. They were mostly the farmers until they start to try to get more support in the cities from the factory workers. They are very upset by the limitations on the supply of money because money at this time was tied to gold. We could only have as much money as we had gold to back it up. So they wanted to have silver be the standard. They wanted money to be based on silver because there's more silver, there could be more money in our money supply. And we talked about, remember in lesson 1, we talked about their platform. Many of the other things they wanted, such as a graduated income tax, the direct election of senators. They wanted limits on immigration because they were very fearful of immigrants coming and taking their jobs, since they had added those factory workers to their political base. So there's some nativism. The progressives, remember, they are different from the populists because a lot of them are higher class, they're wealthier. more educated, a lot of college degrees. They rely on more modern ideas and scientific techniques and theories at the time, including, we'll talk about eugenics. They believed in a modern, educated, uniform culture. Uniform means everybody would be the same. They were mostly white, Anglo-Saxon, meaning British, of British descent, Protestant, that's Christian, like your Baptist, Methodist, that kind of Christian. Middle-class reformers, okay? And they're going to try to impose their ideas in various states through things I've mentioned, like a literacy test. That's where you force somebody to take a test, supposedly so they can prove they can read and write in order to vote. But what this is really going to do is it's going to stop Blacks from voting. It was targeted, it was malicious. It was not a simple test that proved you could read or write. It was purposely the most complicated, convoluted test you could imagine to purposely keep specific people from being able to vote. And it was very corrupt. But that is something that they imposed because of their high-minded ideas here. Poll taxes, that's where you had to pay money in order to vote, and grandfather clauses. That's where, like, oh, if it applied to my grandpappy, then it applies to me too. It didn't apply to your grandpappy, it doesn't apply to you. And then here's some of the things that both groups believed in. So they're both wanting reforms. They both are against big businesses. They both are going to try to help the poor and the working class, white Americans primarily. And they are both somewhat nativist, as a lot of Americans were at this time, sadly. So a muckraker, please highlight. Muckrakers are incredibly important in both back then during the Progressive Era in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and today in 2020. A muckraker is a journalist, like a newspaper writer or a news author, a journalist, who is trying to write about things that need to be fixed. They're called muckrakers because they're like raking up the muck, the nasty, terrible things that are happening out in society. These writers are writing the stories about those things to bring the truth to the public so we can be informed about what's wrong, about what's happening out there. And so that hopefully we can make a difference and make things, or at least start to make things better. That is what a muckraker does. Now, during this time, you also had so this is a really good journalist who's doing a good public service, trying to help everybody by enlightening us to the problems in our society, raking up that muck. Like you see, here's a rake. They're raking up the dirty stuff so we can all see it. We can make things better. These are good journalists. The bad journalists during this time were known as yellow journalists. And yellow journalists, they're bad because they would not write about the truth. They would write about things that they figured would be very popular, and they would sensationalize those stories, like exaggerate them to make it even more popular and intriguing for people, and kind of try to sell as many papers as they possibly could with these sensationalized, exaggerated stories. We'll talk more about those bad sort of journalists. Again, they're called yellow journalists. When we get to this little war in 1898 called the Spanish-American War. But back to the muckrakers, these were good investigative journalists. Sometimes they'd go undercover to get a good story. Sometimes they just did a lot of research work, but they are finding the truth underneath society. They're looking to see these problems, they're researching them, and then they're writing up their columns and exposing these problems to our society so we can make things better. That's a muckraker. One of the most famous muckrakers during this time was Upton Sinclair. And Upton Sinclair, he is going to go undercover in the meatpacking industry. We haven't talked about beef since like the cattle boom, but remember, you had all these like Texas Longhorns and Western cattle being herded onto railroad cars, like in Kansas and stuff, and being shipped east to meatpacking processing plants, factories where they would slaughter the animals in the east, like in cities like Chicago. And so that's where Upton Sinclair is going to go undercover into one of these slaughterhouses, a place where they cut up the slaughtered animal's meat and package it. It's called a packing plant. And he basically takes notes as he's working undercover there. He talks to many of the workers, and he finds out that there's a lot of messed up stuff happening in Chicago's meatpacking district. For instance, in the slaughterhouse where Upton Sinclair was interviewing people and investigating undercover as this journalist, this muckraker, he finds out that workers oftentimes, they have no insurance, and they would often get hurt on the job. They're constantly working, at cutting meat, hour after hour. They're chopping up all that meat with these big cleavers. Oftentimes they would chop off their fingers or portions of their fingers. And all this meat, by the way, is basically, I'm sure that the blood and everywhere, once you chop off a finger, it's nasty. But then somebody comes along to gather up that meat, little chopped fingers could get into it, and then that could be packaged. And it was the case. People during this time period, when they opened up that can of processed meat, they would find like the ends of human fingers in their meat. That was disgusting, but it was true. These poor workers that Sinclair interviewed, their hands in general, if they didn't lose their fingers to the meat cleavers, their hands in general were just crisscrossed with all sorts of cuts. Their knuckles were bloody. Their thumbs would just be little nubs and stuff. Very, very dangerous work and very costly to their hands with all this cutting that they did in the processing of the meat. Also, they would work with vats of acid. Acid is very corrosive. They would have these big vats, like big cauldrons of acid that they would dump the big haunches, of the cows, the big bulk of the meat, they would dump it into, because it's really hard to get the animal's skin, its hide, off of the meat. So they would dump it into the vat of acid to kind of loosen it up so they could pry the hide off. Sometimes if a worker got too close, that acid, when they dumped the meat in, would spray up and it would hit them in the face. They could be permanently blinded. Their skin could be burned off. There were even a few workers who, they're holding these big giant things of meats, like a big 80-pound hunk of animal carcass in their arms, trying to get it over the edge into this big cauldron of acid. Sometimes they fell into the acid. Sometimes they died. Also, these places were extremely unsanitary. Nobody's going around cleaning anything. You have blood, viscera, sweat, spit, all of these things, all over the ground. And of course, what is that going to attract, right? Lots of insects, but also lots of vermin, mice, rats, big, nasty rats everywhere. And what did those rats do? They're chewing on this meat and they're pooping. Okay. Now the company would put out like rat traps, and they would put rat poison all over the place. But then that rat poison was being swept up with the meat and the dead rats. And this poison now, it's all being swept up and then put into the meat that's being put into the cans. It's going onto the shelves that people are buying and eating. Imagine eating rat pooped on, dead rat, human fingered, nasty meat. That's what people were eating. And that is what Upton Sinclair's book, which it's going to be published in 1906, it was called The Jungle. That's what it was about. It's not about the Jungle Book or something with happy animals in a jungle and Mowgli and all that. No, The Jungle is the urban jungle. And it's talking about this right here, meat packing, okay? The slaughtering of animals and the processing of their meat, what goes into our food. And it was disgusting. And people read about this and they were, like us, they were horrified. They demanded, these progressives are reading Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. They're going to demand that the government, now under President Teddy Roosevelt, do something about this, that the government take action, which is going to lead in 1906 to Congress and passing and Roosevelt signing into law the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Meat Inspection Act, one of very important laws. In fact, when our government goes into shutdown, that's one of the few government positions that must remain open for the public safety. That is where you send in meat inspectors to these slaughterhouses, and they make sure that what is being put into the food that we eat is safe for our consumption. The Pure Food and Drug Act, That's like the FDA today, the Food and Drug Administration. They monitor the nutrition labels, seeing that people are able to identify what specific ingredients are going into our food. It used to be the case that lots of medicines back in the late 1800s would include like cocaine, and they would include heroin, and they would include all sorts of what we consider today pretty powerful, like harmful drugs. A lot of medications would, and it was seen as no big deal. Well, that's things are going to evolve over time as we get better science. But what the Pure Food and Drug Act did is it said people have a right to know what goes into their food. So both of these laws right here, these were about protecting consumers, the people who eat the food. Now, Upton Sinclair, this muckraking, investigative journalist, this really good journalist, the reason he did all this, once he was done with his undercover work and gathered all his notes about what was happening, he wrote this book really to help those poor workers. You could see on the cover of the book, there's this worker that is being, hung kind of like one of those cattle carcasses, that he was being treated no better than an animal. And kind of like the other factory workers, he's just a machine in the cog of this big company, easily replaceable. His fingers can get cut off, his hands can be shredded, he could fall into vats of acid. He's working, 12 to 14 hours a day, working on Saturdays, not being treated very well. Sinclair wanted to hit the public in the heart, to make people feel for the plight of these workers and help them out, help their situation, get them better conditions. They said, while I aim for the public heart, I ended up hitting them in the stomach instead. Because that's what the public really cared about when they read this. Not, oh, those poor workers, but, oh my God, did you see what's going into my meat? What is happening to my food? Please fix that. So just keep that in mind when we're thinking about The Jungle, this book about the meat packing industry. All right, with that, we will end our part 1 of the Progressives Drive Reform, lesson 2. I will talk to you guys later. Let's see. Thank you very much. Bye.